الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألا إن أولياء الله لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Aslamualaykum wa rahmatulahi wa barkaatuhu, dear viewers. Welcome to Allah TV. Today is the very first podcast in regards to my new project, SufiTalk. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll talk about a very highly ranked Sufi poet, a dervish, a Awliya Allah from Turkey. He was a great Turkish thinker, a poet who spread the light of knowledge for humanity for centuries, such as his recommendations to embrace the ethics of patience, satisfaction, tolerance, generosity, goodness and righteousness, following the Sharia in line with the correct teachings of Islam. The thinker, whose exact date of birth is unknown, lived in Anatolia from the mid-13th century to the first quarter of the 14th century according to various sources. The name of this great saint was Hazrat Yunas Emre alayhi rahmah. Before Yunas Emre chose the path of Tasawwuf, he graduated as a Qadi, a judge of the Sharia law at the prominent madrasa in Konya, Turkey in the year 1268, and took up a position in the city of Nalihan. Hazrat Yunas Emre belonged to a Tariqat Baktashi order. Every order has its own speciality and every order has its own work. Certain kind of spirituality attracts people to that particular order for the work of Deen Islam. The Baktashi order was concentrating mainly on the military, who followed the order of Mahlavi of Hazrat Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi alayhi rahmah. Yunas Emre was a poor Anatolian villager who would starve if the harvest was bad and live like a king when it was good. One day he ran out of seeds for his field, so he got on his donkey and started collecting various wild fruits from the forest in hope of exchanging them for seeds. After a long journey, he stopped at Haji Baktash's famous Sufi lodge in Anatolia. When he entered Haji Baktash's room and asked him for some seeds in exchange for his wild fruits, Haji Baktash, a grand sheikh and a poet in his own right, offered Hazrat Yunas Emre a breath of blessings in return for his fruits. But Yunas Emre refused. Haji Baktash then offered 10 breaths of blessings for each handful, but Yunas Emre still refused. To his surprise, Yunas Emre ended up with more seeds than he could carry. Now, as he was traveling back to his village, Hazrat Yunas Emre started to think deeply about this man, saying to himself, he must be a noble spirit. And how could someone be so generous to a poor stranger like me? So he took the seeds back to Haji Baktash and asked for a breath of blessings. However, Haji Baktash replied, I cannot, because I have turned over your padlock to Tabtuk Emre. In Sufi terms, this means that a spiritual guide, a sheikh or a peer has been appointed for Yunas Emre on his path of Sirat al-Mustaqim in search of God's truth. This was the beginning of another long journey for Yunas Emre, the first stage of the way, where he perfectly describes it in this text. I have a question for you, O Darwish. What kind of path do the sheikhs order? The answer to this obstacle of palace is the flame from the chimney of the house of love. The first door is Shariat, religion or law, commanding exile or journey. Every syllable of the Holy Quran telling the sins of hope. Hazrat Yunas Emre states that one should feel the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to start this journey of transformation. The house of love allows one to overcome the obstacle of palace, which could be a metaphor for worldly desires that are believed to be barriers on a Sufi's path after one falls in love with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then the journey begins with the appointment of a guide, and adjoining a Sufi lodge is hinted in the mention of Shariat and the Holy Quran. Hazrat Yunas Emre was guided by Haji Bektas, who in turn took him to the doorstep of Sheikh Tabtuk Emre. Yunas Emre's meeting with Haji Bektas serves the purpose of associating him with the highest possible maqam of Awliya Allah. Only after this meeting he was guided to Tabtuk Emre, who was a less famous saint. He immediately joins Tabtuk Emre in a gathering where he is to serve his master. One of his main jobs was at Fajr time, he would go up to the mountains, gather wood for the lodge, and at Maghrib time he would be back in the presence of his sheikh. According to some scholars, Tabtuk Emre's saz, which is a traditional instrument of Anatolian music, what attracted Yunas Emre to the Sufi lodge. Until one day he got bored and left the Sufi lodge, wandering randomly until he meets 7 enlightened men and becomes their comrade. Every night one of them prays silently for one person, and a feast of table appears for the group. Then the 7 men request Yunas Emre to pray, but Yunas doesn't know through whose wasila they was asking for. He didn't even know whose name they was mentioning. So he said, Ya Rabbi, I am praying for the same person these enlightened ones are praying for. Please do not embarrass me. And 2 tables instead of 1 appear. Shocked, the enlightened ones question Yunas about whom he prayed to, but Yunas demands that they should tell him first. Their answer was, we was praying for a dervish called Yunas, who is a follower of Tabtuk Emre. On hearing this at once, without a word, Yunas leaves the group and returns to the Sufi lodge. One miracle after another leads Yunas through this journey of hardship. The way and how easily he could have gone astray from it, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala led Emre back to the way through certain signs. Hazrat Yunas Emre's saintly position in the eyes of Anatolian peasants and the respect shown to him by the enlightened ones means that not even Yunas himself didn't realize this importance. Perhaps Yunas was still on the early stages of his journey and had not yet acquired a good amount of self-knowledge. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala led Yunas back to the way through certain signs. Going back to when Hazrat Yunas Emre alayhi rahmah arrives at the lodge of Tabtuk Emre after a long time, he talks to Tabtuk Emre's wife. She tells him to go and lie on the doorstep of Tabtuk's house, saying when Tabtuk leaves the house for Fajr prayer, he will stumble upon you, and due to his poor vision, he will ask, who is this? And I will tell him, Yunas. If he answers, which Yunas? You should leave and never ever come back. But if he says, you mean our friend Yunas, this means he still loves you. In that case, you should ask for forgiveness from him and ask for his mercy. The next day, Tabtuk Emre answers by saying, you mean our friend Yunas, with excitement and tears. Tabtuk Emre forgives Yunas for leaving the lodge, and he rejoins the Sufi lodge, resuming his work of carrying firewoods. One night, there is a very happy banquet at the lodge, and Tabtuk Emre asks the poet of the lodge to recite poetry, but somehow is not able to utter a single word. Then Tabtuk Emre turns to Yunas, declaring what Haji Bektash once told you is at last a reality. Your lock is now unlocked. Yunas burst into a stream of poetry, and the congregation becomes ecstatic. The great poet Yunas is now born. Hazrat Yunas Emre spent 40 years at the feet of his master Sheikh Tabtuk Emre, and he carried on with his duties collecting wood from the mountains, where he would start to recite poetry and na'ats and mawluds and poems praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sending salawat to the Holy Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and praising his Sheikh. The Sheikh also gave his daughter's hand in marriage to Hazrat Yunas Emre. The love for Yunas, for his Sheikh, was beyond our minds, and no matter what his Sheikh orders, Yunas Emre accepted it and respected it and carried on the path of Siratul Mustaqim. Sometime later, there was one woman he heard people loving this Yunas Emre. He says, who is this Yunas Emre? He's not even a scholar. He doesn't even know Arabic. And people love him and are reading his poems that are unacceptable in Sharia. He sat by the riverside, reading after reading. The first page, he said to himself, this is shirk. He tears it, crumples it, throws it into the river. He tears the next page and the next page. When the book was almost finished, he came across one poem which said, Yunas Emre utter no word that is not true, for a Mullah Qasim will come to cross-examine you. Mullah Qasim, upon reading the poem, burst into tears. As he understood his mistake, he saved the rest of the precious poetry. Today, some historians claim that 2/3 of Hazrat Yunas Emre's poetry was destroyed. After the death of Hazrat Yunas Emre, his followers, his murids, gathered what they could find of his poems into books. Now I'd like to move on to some key points. For those who don't know this, Hazrat Yunas Emre was a contemporary of Rumi, lived in the same region of Anatolia. There is a story told of a meeting between the two great souls, where Hazrat Jalaluddin Rumi asked Hazrat Yunas Emre what he thought of his great work of the Masnavi. Hazrat Yunas Emre said, excellent, excellent, but I would have done it differently. Surprised, Hazrat Jalaluddin Rumi asked how. So Hazrat Yunas Emre replied, I would have written, I came from the eternal, clothed myself in flesh and took the name Yunus. Now let me quote what Hazrat Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi says openly about the status of Hazrat Yunas Emre alayhi rahmah. He says, every station that I have reached, I see the footprints of Yunas Emre. If I go to another station, he has already reached and he is far beyond above me. Hazrat Yunas Emre submitted to his Sheikh Tabtuk Emre. He served his Sheikh. He did not sit to pray with his Sheikh. He did not sit to make zikr with his Sheikh. He did not sit to eat with his Sheikh. But he followed his master's orders and did not once utter a word against what was given to him. So my dear viewers, as we are coming towards the end, until this day, Hazrat Yunas Emre remains a popular figure in a number of countries. His Ur Sharif is celebrated, stretching from Azerbaijan to the Balkans, with 7 different and widely dispersed localities, disputing the privilege of having his tomb within their boundaries. Hazrat Yunas Emre's most important book is Risalatul Nushayya and Divan, plus many more. The lesson that we should learn from Hazrat Yunas Emre is that we should indulge ourselves in the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Rasul and His chosen ones. And if we follow a true Shaykh, then submit yourself to following him fully. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself has appointed him as your guide and your teacher on the path of Sirat al-Mustaqim. Sadaqallahu al-Azim wa sadaqa Rasulih.